Greetings, true believers, and welcome to another astonishing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This week's story begins nearly 2 decades ago with a secret program that was being funded by the notorious terrorist group known as Hydra. It was called Project Shock for the subdimensional, human-based occultechnic conduit, the purpose of which was to bond a human being with a special armored suit that was capable of channeling the extra-dimensional energy known as Dark Force. The Dark Force dimension has actually served as a power source for several individuals over the years, including Darkstar, Silhouette, Blackout, Cloak, and Mr. Negative. However, the shock armor was highly experimental and would eventually prove fatal to the wearer. Regardless, the scientist who developed the armor wore it himself as a superpowered operative codenamed Shock, unaware of the true nature of his employers. As Shock, he could use Dark Force energy to enhance his speed and strength, he could fly and fire blasts of dark energy, and even manipulate his own body to elongate and enlarge his torso and appendages. During this time, he worked with an enigmatic Hydra agent known only as Crown. However, Shock eventually learned that his research was being backed by a subversive organization led by the Nazi war criminal Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. The scientist took the shock armor and fled, moving to New York City and changing his name to William Fields. As Fields, he married a woman named Marjorie, and the two had a son named Todd. However, Hydra continued their experiments without Fields, and Crown volunteered to be their next test subject, giving him powers similar to Shock. Crown eventually tracked down Fields over a decade after the two had last met. Fields told his wife and child to take his research notes to a trusted colleague, Dr. Sidney Lanning. The sadistic Crown killed Fields for betraying Hydra, but allowed his family to escape, promising the boy they would one day meet again. Marjorie and her son changed their names to start a new life, and so Todd Fields became Neil Aiken. Sometime after this, a man named Vincente Fortunato became Crown's new superior within Hydra, and he reported directly to Baron Strucker himself. Fortunato is better known as a career criminal and had previously worked under the notorious mob boss Don Rigoletto as his right-hand man. However, Rigoletto was murdered by his own trusted enforcer, a young Wilson Fisk. Thus began Fisk's meteoric rise to become the kingpin of crime, while those who opposed him were put to death. Fortunato narrowly escaped this fate, returning to Italy to build his power base in Rome. For the next part of our tale, we turn our attention to a man many Marvelites may be familiar with, the Greek scientist Dr. Michael Morbius. Morbius was a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who suffered from a rare blood disease, one that was slowly dissolving his cells. Not wishing to distress his fiancée, Martine Bancroft, Morbius secretly pursued radical experimental treatments which utilized DNA harvested from vampire bats. However, these experiments resulted in a side effect that neither Michael Morbius nor his lab partner, Emil Nikos, could have foreseen. Morbius was transformed into a pale-skinned, bloodthirsty creature and killed Nikos. He was no longer dying, but with his newly enhanced strength, regenerative powers, and a need to feed on human blood to survive, he had become something resembling a supernatural creature. Since his unique form of pseudo-vampirism makes him distinct from Dracula and his undead ilk, Morbius has become known as the Living Vampire, and his condition became known to other members of the scientific community, including a woman named Dr. Andrea Jansen. Jansen was a hematologist and a molecular biologist whose interest in the case of Michael Morbius affected the direction of her research, and as a result, she became involved with Crown. Like the shock armor, Crown's Dark Force powers were slowly killing him, and he recruited Jansen to use her expertise to help save his life. The two also became lovers, and Dr. Jansen even joined Hydra to better help Crown. Eventually, 7 years after killing William Fields, Crown and his men tracked down Dr. Sidney Lanning, the scientist who Fields had left his research notes to. Lanning had used Fields' work to create an experimental energy generator which presumably tapped into the Dark Force dimension. However, Fields' notes were incomplete, and so Lanning was still in the earliest stages of testing his machine when he was accosted by Crown. Meanwhile, like William Fields, Sidney Lanning was a professor at Empire State University, and so while this was happening, 2 of his students happened to enter his lab, Peter Parker and Neil Aiken. Parker, I'm sure, needs no introduction as the alter ego of the masked vigilante known as the Amazing Spider-Man. After slipping away from Aiken and changing into his costume, Spider-Man attacked Crown and his men. And of course, Neil Aiken was originally Todd Fields, the son of William Fields. And in fact, Aiken had inherited his father's Dark Force armor, allowing him to transform into the second Shock. Spider-Man and Shock battled Crown while Lanning attempted to shut down his generator, but it seemed to be too late as the machine began to overload. Crown intended on absorbing the Dark Force energy released to grow even stronger. Presumably he was working with Jansen to stabilize his powers without losing them. However, Shock's armor was able to interface with the machine, feeding the energy back into its source. This opened up a spatial rift, and at Shock's insistence, Spider-Man knocked Crown and his men inside. Shock claimed that the rift led back to where they came from, but based on his brief description, it's possible that it led back to the Dark Force dimension itself. Lanning's generator then exploded, but Shock was able to absorb the brunt of the blast. Meanwhile, Michael Morbius continued to suffer from his pseudo-vampirism, surviving on blood and death, but desiring a cure. Not long after Spider-Man's first encounter with Crown, he came across Morbius attempting to abduct Dr. Andrea Jansen, the very same scientist who had fallen in love with Crown and joined Hydra to try and stop his Dark Force powers from killing him. Of course, Morbius didn't know that. He only knew that she was a brilliant hematologist and hoped that she could help him. However, because of Spider-Man's interference, Jansen escaped. The 2 old enemies battled, and Morbius was able to momentarily satiate his hunger with the wall crawler's blood. He left the hero weakened but alive and escaped as well. The following night, Morbius tracked Jansen down again and confronted her at the university. However, Spider-Man intervened yet again, leading to another fight between him and the living vampire. This time things were complicated by interference from the so-called Friends of Humanity, a violent anti-mutant hate group who mistakenly thought the 2 opponents were mutants. Spider-Man stopped Morbius from slaughtering the bigots and was himself saved by his wife, Mary Jane Watson Parker, who stood up to his vampiric foe. This conflict ended when Dr. Jansen herself offered Morbius a packet of blood, telling him that if he accepted it and stopped fighting, she would help him. But if he continued his violent behavior, he would be on his own. Morbius agreed, and the 2 doctors left together, with Jansen promising to help cure him. She brought him back to her private island in the Caribbean, where she began to examine his condition more closely. However, Morbius was horrified to learn that he'd been duped when Crown arrived, and his captor revealed her true allegiance by uttering the phrase, "Hail Hydra." The 2 then brought Morbius to the Staten Island estate of Crown's superior, Vincente Fortunato. You see, due to his own battles with the likes of Spider-Man and Daredevil, Wilson Fisk's criminal empire had fallen, allowing his former associate to return to New York. Fortunato revealed to Crown that Hydra had discovered the whereabouts of William Fields' son, Neil Aiken. And so Crown's Hydra troops descended upon Aiken while he was with Peter Parker and another student, Abby Levin. Aiken was forced to transform into Shock in front of his classmates, effectively blowing his secret identity. However, before Parker could join the fight as Spider-Man, Crown took him hostage and forced Shock to surrender. Both men were brought back to Fortunato's estate, where Parker was locked in a room with Morbius, the living vampire. Meanwhile, Dr. Jansen examined the Shock armor under the supervision of Fortunato. Not only that, but the Supreme Hydra leader, Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, observed the situation personally. However, after being assured that Project Shock would not be delayed further, the old Nazi left to take care of other matters overseas. Fortunato and Crown accompanied Strucker while he left, but while they were gone, the estate was raided by a rival crime boss known as Hammerhead. You see, Fortunato had been using his Hydra connections to move in on Hammerhead's territory, and so Hammerhead wanted to strike back. He and his forces killed Jansen and abducted Morbius, Parker, and Aiken just because Fortunato was holding them. It soon became clear that Hammerhead didn't have the technology required to restrain Shock, but Aiken couldn't simply leave while Parker was still a hostage. And so Hammerhead and Shock formed an uneasy alliance against their common enemy. Hammerhead also told Shock that he would release Parker, but his men in fact pushed him from the top of the building. Of course, this was the perfect opportunity for him to slip away and change into Spider-Man. Meanwhile, Crown, enraged by the death of his lover, was ordered to strike back at their foes. And so he personally led a Hydra assault on Hammerhead's building. Hammerhead and Shock fought back, each one trying to take down Crown. But even with Spider-Man joining the fight, Crown began to overpower them with his Dark Force abilities. However, in the assault, Morbius was able to break free from his bonds and also attacked Crown, recognizing his evil. The two foes engaged in an aerial battle while Shock could sense the Dark Force energy within Crown building to an overload. Fortunately, Spider-Man and Shock were able to combine their powers to redirect the energy upward, destroying the Hydra ship overhead. However, Crown survived the blast and escaped with Morbius. He allied himself with a United States Senator named Stuart Ward, and together they continued to experiment on the living vampire. Eventually, they were able to stabilize Crown's condition and stop his powers from killing him. He lost many of his Dark Force abilities, but was instead transformed into a pseudo-vampire like Morbius, and took the name Hunger. To keep his new thirst for blood satiated, Hunger began abducting people from the streets of New York and keeping them prisoner in an underground chamber. Due to anti-mutant hysteria, many papers blamed the abductions on a mutant menace living in the sewers. Ironically, there was a community of mutants living in the underground tunnels known as the Morlocks, many of which were also captured by Hunger, including their leader, Callisto. And so a mutant known as Marrow decided to investigate these disappearances herself. Marrow was a former Morlock who had left the underground to join the famous team of mutant superheroes, the X-Men. Meanwhile, another one of the individuals captured was Daily Bugle reporter Betty Brant, who just so happened to be a close friend of Peter Parker. This naturally led to Spider-Man and Marrow teaming up to track down the one responsible. Fortunately, these two heroes were able to find Hunger and free his victims, although Spider-Man refused to kill him, and so the vampiric villain escaped. Meanwhile, Wilson Fisk had returned to New York, seeking to reclaim his position as the kingpin of crime. He had gone on the offensive, taking out rival gang leaders and regaining the allegiance of former allies. And in the midst of this violence, Vincente Fortunato was badly injured and hospitalized. And so his son, Giacomo Fortunato, better known by his alias Jimmy 6, stepped up to assume control of the family. Jimmy was a reluctant mobster who disapproved of his father's violent methods. He'd previously attempted to leave his life of organized crime, and Fortunato attempted to have him killed because of it. And so when he took over the family business, he did what his father was unwilling to do and declared a truce with Wilson Fisk. Meanwhile, the primary reason that Senator Ward had allied himself with Crown in the first place was to use him against the underworld bosses. While Fisk was meeting with the captains from various crime families, Ward sent Crown to attack them. While Fisk, Jimmy 6, and a few others escaped, most in attendance were either killed or transformed into Hunger's vampiric thralls. Morbius had also displayed the potential to transform others, but in his case it was a rarity and occurred under unknown circumstances. And so Hunger's vampire mob began striking out against the rival gangs. Meanwhile, Jimmy 6 had his men steal a crate belonging to Hunger, unaware of what was inside. Of course, with the ghastly gang making headlines, it was only a matter of time before Blade, the vampire hunter, became involved. Having worked together before, Spider-Man and Blade joined forces to battle the vampire mob. Of course, with the world's preeminent vampire slayer on the case, Hunger's minions were all soon turned to dust. However, it seemed as though Crown himself would be able to overpower both Spider-Man and Blade. Fortunately, one of Jimmy 6's boys, a mobster named Mutt who had accompanied Spider-Man and Blade, killed the last of Hunger's vampiric thralls. Weakened by the deaths of his servants, Crown escaped and slipped into the night, never to be seen again. And this is where the story of Hunger ends. The Hydra agent turned Dark Force-powered villain turned living vampire has yet to re-emerge, and his ultimate fate is unconfirmed. Although with Blade aware of his existence, one might assume that this problem was quietly taken care of. So let's end off this video by answering some other remaining questions. For example, what's in the box? Specifically the box that Jimmy 6 stole from the vampire mob. Well, the answer to that is simple. It contained Morbius, the living vampire. After being experimented on by Ward and Crown, Morbius was locked away in that crate. When it was taken by the Kingpin, he opened it, unwittingly releasing the living vampire once again. Spider-Man and Blade fought against him, and during that fight, Morbius bit Blade. And it was actually that bite that gave Blade the more vampiric qualities he is known for today. Since his mother was bitten by an undead vampire while giving birth, Blade was born with an immunity to the vampire's supernatural curse. However, Morbius's unique form of pseudo-vampirism affected him differently, granting him many of the powers of an undead vampire but without any of the weaknesses. He also developed a thirst for human blood but would find ways of satiating himself and replenishing his strength without feeding on human victims. As for Jimmy 6, he continued to lead the Fortunato crime family for a time, but his truce with the Kingpin eventually came undone. Furthermore, Vincente Fortunato later recovered from his injuries and reassumed control of his organization. Jimmy's whereabouts after his father's return are unknown, and years later, when Eddie Brock auctioned off the alien costume that turned him into Venom, it was Fortunato who won. He gave the suit to his younger son, Angelo, who then became the new Venom. However, that lasted less than a single night as the alien symbiote rejected Angelo, leaving him to fall to his death. And perhaps the biggest question is, whatever happened to Shock? Well, despite learning that his Dark Force powers would eventually kill him, Shock decided to continue using them for good, subsequently aiding Spider-Man when a being from the Negative Zone created an interdimensional breach. Several years after that, Hydra joined forces with the ninja death cult known as the Hand in a plot to kill a number of superhumans, and then resurrect them as brainwashed soldiers. Unfortunately, it seems as though Shock was one of many to fall victim to this sinister plot. As a result, he and several others were killed by Wolverine when he fought against the Hand and Hydra. However, some who were involved in these events have turned up alive, and so perhaps this isn't truly the end of Shock or Hunger. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what Marvel hero or villain you want to hear about next, and as always, the issues referenced in these videos are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here and vote in monthly polls to add a topic to the schedule. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!